Thank you. Thank you all for being here for this somewhat serious topic. So in this talk, I'll be mixing in some of my personal insights with quotes from a variety of different articles and grief experts. So I'll do my best to kind of signal when I'm quoting somebody else's ideas from my own. So when somebody mentions grief and loss to you, what's the first thing that you think of? For most of us, I imagine it would be a death. In these pandemic times, that can mean losing a person to COVID or COVID complications. These losses are reported to us daily in the news, shared in our social media, and the fear and the weight of them affects us on a regular basis. But these are not the only kinds of losses that we've been forced to endure in the pandemic. Some of us have lost jobs or financial security. Some of us have lost friendships and social ties that we didn't have the energy to keep up over Zoom. Some of us have lost relationships or marriages. Some of us have lost experiences that we looked forward to, in-person graduations, weddings, family holidays. Some of us lost the chance to say goodbye to the people we lost when we couldn't be at their funeral. And all of us lost some of those everyday routines that we used to have, the ability to not worry about our safety when going to a restaurant or a movie, and just some of that basic trust in the world. But how many of us have sat down to grieve all of these losses? They're not your typical examples of what loss looks like, but the grief is just as real. And in some ways, it can be even more painful because we tell ourselves we're not allowed to grieve. This idea is called disenfranchised grief, and the term comes from Kenneth Doka. And a 2021 piece from NPR described it as follows: this feeling of loss that no one seems to understand and that you don't feel entitled to. Doka says disenfranchised grief doesn't just occur when someone dies. It includes other losses that aren't acknowledged: a pet dying, losing a job, or missing out on milestone events like prom or a 50th birthday celebration. So why talk about it? The world's starting to open up again. People are getting vaccinated. Shouldn't we just move on? Hopefully you'll agree with me, no. But just one take on why not to do that. An author called Megan Devine wrote a piece in June 2021 called "You Can't Outrun Pandemic Grief." And in this she wrote, "We all need a break from the pain and uncertainty of recent months. And yet the quest for normalcy could override our need to process what's happened to us. The kind of cognitive distancing that we're seeing now is a normal human trait. As humans, we manage emotional intensity by forcing some space from it. We tend to approach things as an oppositional equation. You can either focus on your losses or you can celebrate the future. You can stay in the dark, hard moments of the pandemic, or you can celebrate your survival. Which one will it be?" So this ties into something that's called the dual process model of grief, where there's a part that is very much loss-oriented, where we're doing that work of grieving and remembering and sort of dwelling in that loss. And then there's another piece that's restoration-oriented. And that's where, even when we go through grief, there are things we do. We do tend to still get up and go to work in the morning. We tend to still need to attend to our daily lives. And there can be a lot of guilt and conflict in that. But I bring that up just to say that that opposition doesn't tend to serve us very well, because sometimes we need to be able to hold the hard moments and celebrate that we're moving on. And as everyone knows who's experienced the loss of a person, that grief does not typically go away. It may become more bearable in some moments than others, but if we never put words to it, get support for it, acknowledge it, whether with a ritual, memorial, or an ongoing effort to find meaning, then it remains unhealed and unresolved. So what are some of these other kinds of losses? One is called secondary losses. And this is explained well on a website called speakinggrief.org, which describes it this way: where the death of a loved one is considered the primary loss, experiences that flow from that death are called secondary losses. Secondary means that these losses come as a result of the death, not that they are any less impactful or less difficult. They can unfold over time or become apparent in the immediate aftermath of the death. Secondary losses are a normal part of grief, and identifying and acknowledging them can often be the first step in grieving them. So some examples of these might be losing our support systems, our financial status, identity, traditions, more. And often these are not the things we typically talk about or ask about when we're supporting someone through their grief. But at any given moment, they might be more consuming and more pressing sometimes than the original loss itself. So that's one thing to consider, just all of those secondary losses that have stacked up on us during the pandemic. Another kind of loss is one of my favorite as a therapist to talk about. It's called ambiguous loss. And this is a term that Dr. Pauline Boss came up with in the 1970s. And ambiguous loss is defined as either physical absence with psychological presence or psychological absence with physical presence. So this first category might include something like going through a divorce, where that person is no longer physically with you, but psychologically, their presence is still there. A kidnapping, where a child is taken away, natural disasters, adoption is something where we see this a lot, where an adopted child can hold on to that psychological presence of their birth family, even if they don't ever get to physically interact with them. In that second side, the psychological absence, that can include somebody going through Alzheimer's, different kinds of dementia. If you're living with somebody who's dealing with addiction or chronic mental health challenges, those people might be physically present in your life, but psychologically, they're not there in the same way that they used to be. So how does this concept show up in the pandemic? Here's an answer from a recent article in Forge that is called "Your Pandemic Sadness is Called Ambiguous Loss." So here's a quote from this. Being unable to determine whether something is here or gone, living or dead, ongoing or over, is what makes a loss ambiguous. And that feeling is what the pandemic has inflicted on most of us. Families separated by travel precautions knew that they would see each other again, but not when. Friends and communities and favorite places were psychologically present. We still considered ourselves part of the community, the neighborhood, the friendship, but physically out of reach. Even now, we know that new variants will arise, but not how vulnerable we'll be. Experts assure us the pandemic will end or subside to manageable levels, but they can't tell us when we'll be safe. So it's just something to consider of what are those different types of more ambiguous, unresolved, and unresolvable losses that we're going through on an ongoing basis. And so now that I've talked about all these different kinds of losses, what do we do about it? What does it look like to grieve? Dr. Boss talks about this in a 2020 interview, and she suggests two approaches. One, she says, find something you can control. This might be activities, hobbies, meditation, something productive. She references how so many people were baking bread at that one point in the pandemic, and that being such a concrete thing with some finality to it. You could feel like you did something in your control and produced an outcome. And her other recommendation is we have to change our way of thinking and find the middle ground. And so she puts this as that kind of both and, yes and philosophy of being able to acknowledge the darkness and the difficulty of the pandemic, and also seeing the ways that we have still found connection or identifying our own personal growth. So another important author and thinker in the grief world is David Kessler. And here's a quote where he walks us through some of the stages of grief as they apply to the pandemic. There's denial, which we say a lot of early on. This virus won't affect us. There's anger. You're making me stay home and taking away my activities. There's bargaining. Okay, if I social distance for 2 weeks, everything will be better, right? There's sadness. I don't know when this will end. And finally, there's acceptance. This is happening. I have to figure out how to proceed. Acceptance, as you might imagine, is where the power lies. We find control in acceptance. I can wash my hands. I can keep a safe distance. I can learn how to work virtually. So many of us are familiar possibly with the 5 stages of grief. David Kessler wrote a book that proposed a 6th stage, finding meaning. And this is another way for us to cope through all of the confusion, the pain, the ambiguity of the present time. So finding meaning might look like finding a way to contribute to a cause of importance to us, advocating for some community or some piece of the pandemic that's meaningful, reconnecting with a hobby or a person that we value. Something that I do a lot of in my work as a trauma therapist is guiding people to incorporate some of these darker moments of their life back into their story and their narrative in a way that gives meaning to it. So finding meaning in where they were, what they went through, and where they are now. And deciding on this meaning and trusting in the meaning that we make of grief is one of the ways that we can find something to control, something we have power over in this extreme helplessness of the pandemic world. Another idea that's come up a lot in some of what I was reading as I prepared for this talk is the rituals. And I think this is a particularly interesting one for an APS community, is what rituals do we bring up to support and process our grief? These are some of the things that I think were taken away through the pandemic, the ability to gather for funerals, to gather for those rituals that we are familiar with, to find community in. And that process of just being able to create a ritual, being able to establish some sort of way to say goodbye to something that's not a palpable physical loss of a person is also another way just to be able to acknowledge its importance. Related to that is also the idea of naming our grief. So knowing that there is such a thing as disenfranchised grief, secondary losses, ambiguous losses, and knowing that it's okay to call this feeling grief and to call the changes in our lives a collective loss. There was an article that came out, I think it was in March 2020 in the Harvard Business Review, that was called "That Discomfort You're Feeling is Grief," or some variation of that. And it was just a great way to kind of kick off the pandemic awareness of people really feeling that unsettled sadness or that something is a little off or a little stuck, and being able to name it as like, this is grief. What we've been going through for over a year is grief. So I'll close with a quote from Pauline Boss. "The way we deal with grief is to share it with someone else. You dishonor it by not noticing it as a loss." Thank you.